A horror game created by Oddworld Inhabitants would be quite something, I think. The Oddworld games are dark, but they've never really delved into outright horror. I recently spoke about how the Oddworld games have some monsters and villains that could be absolutely terrifying, if they wanted to be. We've only seen a fraction of them and what they've done in-game, but of course there's tons of information of the lore outside the game, and some of the things I've read or heard about them are really super disturbing. It's quite interesting actually that Oddworld Inhabitants have never looked at the smaller game market, such as independent horror games. I bet they'd have done incredibly well in that market, but for some reason they've always tried to go big, perhaps because it's expected of them maybe. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. Oddworld to this day are pioneers. I've previously mentioned that Unity are incredibly impressed by what they're doing with Oddworld Soulstorm, as they're pushing that technology to its limits, and I suppose if they decided to work on smaller games they potentially wouldn't be breaking the boundary as much, and it might be seen as a step back. However, if they worked on smaller projects between games, it could supplement their funds to work on the big games, and plus it would provide more for people to play. Nevertheless, it's just an idea, and there's probably reasons that they haven't done that already. Still, it'd be really interesting to see what Oddworld Inhabitants would do with a horror game, or even just another developer using Oddworld assets to create such a thing. There's so much that could be done. A first-person survival horror game perhaps, where you have to survive various environments infested with wild and deadly scrabs, paramites and fleeches. Or maybe a game set in Vikers labs in which you discover the horrors of what the Vikers are doing and encounter the results of their horrific experiments these evil scientists have done on various creatures, turning them into horrifying monsters that you have to avoid. Kind of like how the puzzles are all good, nice and fluffy throughout Munch's Odyssey until you get the bad ending, then the puzzles turning on Abe and Munch, and the bad ending of that game is one of the most terrifying moments in all the Oddworld games in my opinion. The way they laugh is just really disturbing to me. These are just a couple of examples of very basic ideas of horror games set in the Oddworld universe, you know, that I'm just spitballing here, just come from the top of my head, but I think it'd certainly be great if something along those lines was made using the wide variety of monsters, villains, and outright the stories that could be told through this medium. The Oddworld games all have dark stories supplemented by humour. Lorne Lanning is clearly very good at telling dark and disturbing stories, and if you were to outright write a plot for a horror game, especially set in the Oddworld universe, it'd be interesting to see a truly dark take of the franchise. Even so, I think it still have that signature humour to some degree, and I don't think that's a bad thing. You know, Alfred Hitchcock is, very famous for directing many horror films, and of course known as the master of suspense. He's generally known for his dark, thrilling style, but he always had a sort of sense of humour underlying the darkness. I remember watching a question and answer session with him once, and an audience member said to him something like, "Why haven't you made any comedies?" And Hitchcock replied, "I have made comedies." And the guy said, "Well, which of your films are comedies?" And Hitchcock replied, "All of them," to which the audience laughed. I think it's sort of a similar thing with Lorne Lanning and Oddworld. The subject matter of his games is really dark and serious on so many levels, but it's always paired with humour. Hopefully, maybe one day, they might consider making just like a small horror game set in the Oddworld universe. Maybe something to do with SligStorm perhaps, and they could use that to give the fans something to play while also making money from it, which I'd guess they would, and they'd be able to use so much stuff from the Oddworld universe to scare and disturb people, and maybe even tell a brand new but familiar horrifying story in the process. An Oddworld horror game would be genuinely, truly terrifying.
Hello, follow me.